I would like to start by giving you a glimpse of my background, which will provide a better frame to the approach and questions I have raised to the documentation that will be shared with you. So I got my degree and master's in art history, and my PhD is in museology and artistic heritage. And I took there the opportunity to investigate aspects of the production of art in Christian objects for local consumption and the artistic relations between Portugal and the west coast of India, in particular Goa. So my research focus since quite early on the history of consumptions and in these various aspects. A theme I developed also in my postdoc through the study of female artistic consumption at the Portuguese court between the end of the 15th century and the 16th century. So since 2018, I have been focusing on one hand on the study of dressing and its agency, in which I include the development of the embodied term studies, and on the other, on dress as a device of communication and identity capable of transmitting rank, wealth, magnificence, and personal as well as group virtue. And as such, dress was an inherently political statement, richly materializing the qualities associated to the wearer. As both Erin Griffey and Ulinka Rublak have previously stated, clothing necessitated careful selection across every aspect of the attired body: the choice of garment type, the fabric, the cut, the color, the texture, and the decoration. This was based on the inherent dialectic in clothing between the subject and the observer, the presentation and the perception. As such, at the early modern courts, elites were keenly aware that they were always on display, performing and being observed, and thus being what Ulinka Rublak called a social group supremely dress literate. My presentation confirms this characterization as a result of the exercise of microanalysis of 13 documents referring to dress commissioning to the Infanta Maria in the year 1535. So finally, a quick characterization of the main characters referred to in the documentation. Who was Infanta Maria? Born in 1521, she was the daughter of Manuel I and his third wife, Eleanor of Austria, older sister of Charles V. As can be seen from this intricate genealogy, the matrimonial relationship between the Portuguese and Castilian, and I'm referring to the houses of Castile and Aragon by that time, reigning dynasties were deep, almost obsessive, meaning that these, and particularly the following generation, was made up of children with only 2 pairs of grandparents. So I don't know how much do you know about genealogies in early modern Europe, but I think that the red lines express the really intricate and most problematic connection, matrimonial relations of this family, particularly, which are in fact just 2 families. Most of them are married between each other. And for instance, the mother of Infanta Maria was also the sister of her brother, the king, that followed the death of their father. So this was a rather complex genealogy and explains these intricate connections between the courts of Castile and Portugal. So also because of their marriage, of their parents' marriage contract, Maria was very wealthy. And according to the same contract, she was to be raised as a princess and marry as a queen. So Maria was therefore the half-sister of King John III, who had ascended the throne in December of the same year of her birth, following the death of their father. 2 years later, John would become in charge of his sister's education after Queen Eleanor left for Castile following intrigues in the Portuguese and Castilian courts that are beyond the scope of this presentation. In 1525, John married Catherine of Austria, younger sister of Maria's mother, and the Infanta moved into the Queen's household. For those of you who are not so familiar to Portuguese archives, it is worth clarifying that this small sample is relevant because within the scope of the documental collections prior to the 1755 earthquake, it is a rather fortunate case. As to the opposite, those are rather scarce, dispersed, and truncated. The fact that there are 13 documents with successive monthly dates in the year 1535 allow us to understand the tendency of commissions that were made in a court context and the amount of documentation that was lost or remains unidentified. The orders run through the year 1535, as already mentioned, starting as early as the 2nd of January and going until December. This documentation concerns the day-to-day management of the private affairs and household of the king and his family, even though the process of issuing them is the same as for producing of official royal documentation. The king would be in a room detailing his orders, seconded by at least 2 officials of his chambers, Manuel Velho, his treasurer, and Sebastião Costa, one of his secretaries, both mentioned in all the documents. The 5th omnipresent character is Joan of Blasfet, the Queen's chambermaid, to whom the gowns and other dress were delivered. Unfortunately, the names of the sailors and seamstresses are never mentioned, with one exception that we'll see ahead, nor does the document allow us to to know the production itinerary from commission to receipt of the finished product. It provides, on the other hand, information that attests to how sartorial knowledge was part of the daily life and proficiency of a courtier in the 16th century, relegating to periods closer to our own the charge of futility and character to which fashion studies are sometimes subjected. The documents also show that these highly masterly skills were therefore part of the body of knowledge acquired while being educated at the court, either as a prince or an officer of the royal household. For example, in the document dated from the 2nd of January, the king mentions only carded fabric to sew hábito, that is, a sort of gown. The king went so far as to specify that he wanted it, and I am quoting, just sprayed, without the fabric being fully wet in the process. By naming the technique and specifying aspects of the process without further explanation, one assumes that the technical know-how was shared by the chain of actors described earlier. These documents also give us a microscopic view of some specific trades whose holders were part of the wages book of the royal or the infanta's households. Although it is not possible to conclude that the production took place within the palace complex, we learn that the infanta had a serigueiro, that is a silk manufacturer, at the age of 14. In this other document of April the 6th, the embroiderer is mentioned without being named. It is likely that this embroiderer was part of the king's servants rather than Maria's, and the fact that the king does not need to name it shows that all his officials would be able to identify who made the embroidered cloth. Finally, as Portuguese is a gendered language, one understands that the embroiderer was a man, who also reveals the potential of this type of document to characterize the social and gender environments in which the trades related to the production and transformation of textiles grew in the 16th century. This document is also the first of the small sample presented here, commissioning various kinds of garments and accessories, reflecting both the sartorial knowledge and the chromatic panoply, much more differentiated and interesting than that depicted, for instance, in painting from the same period. And I should call your attention, for instance, to such a small document has 2 kinds of head covers, and he specifically mentions the boina gracia and the chapéus, which are different in terms of what it was perceived to cover the head of a princess. Dress literacy is also evident in the way the king carefully describes the features of the gowns. As in the first item mentioned in this commission, in which the king orders a cota, a kind of long gown tied to the body and with a wide skirt, to be made for his sister in yellow Rouen lined cloth, ornamented with 3 bandage, that is, 3 white stripes, and a yellow velvet edging. It is likely that the gown had some kind of slash in the bodice, once the description mentions that all the stripes, the diliscos, which is still something that I do not know what it means, the pestanas, which were the decorative elements that border the edges of the garment shapes, and the roda, literally wheel, that is the band that ran along the entire lower length of the skirt, were linked with yellow satin. In short, this document alone mentions different types of garments: cotas, bodices, sleeves, one loba, and hooded cloths. Knowledge about the textures and sensorial values of fabric, as well as the application of their characteristics in different functions in dressing, is easily understood by the number of fabrics and ribbons and the detail of how they were used. Rouen linen cloth, velvet, satin, taffeta, and chamelot. Wide and narrow ribbons, as well as those identified as French, that certainly had specific features and functions that escape our comprehension. Finally, sequins, decorating sleeves, and I am quoting, in any color the infanta desired, end of quotation, because education at court included a wide span of knowledge and mastery of what was proper. One's clothing shaped how a person was seen, and therefore who they were. Sorry again. Identity thus becoming not a fact, but rather the outcome of these sorts of social assessments and evaluation by others. I selected this last document for 2 main reasons. On the one hand, it mentions verdugados, a flexible structure that evolved into the complex and wide 17th century farthingales, and that constrained the elite female shapes for centuries. The verdugado was a skirt made with a series of hoops that widened towards the feet to create a triangular or conical silhouette, and often used as an undergarment that characterized Iberian clothing. As this sentence underlined, was described with the same care as the outer garments, and was also made of velvet, satin, or taffeta, in colors that were perhaps unexpected, as yellow, and which were combined with the other layers of clothing that dressed the female body. The second reason why I have chosen this document is it's because it introduces a very interesting topic of analysis, and that assumed a significant role in our days: recycling. In 16th century, everything was used until it was burnt out. Materials were very expensive and sometimes scarce. Skills had to be paid for, and even at court, objects were reused to their limits. This document is also the only of the 13 This document is also the only of the 13 that mentions the name of a tailor, Bento Rodrigues, to whom the king treasurers pay the feitio of a dress. The feitio was the most common word in the 16th century primary source for cut, the skill that distinguished tailors from other professionals that depended on geometric knowledge to perform their trade. Finally, and because this is a mention that brings together that brings together specialists in dyes, pigments and colors, and analysis and conservation, I would like to draw attention to the 2 colors I have added to the slide, pardo and alionado. These colors recur in the documentation, but their names do not derive from abstractions, but from chromatic characteristics of raw fibers and material and animal fur. They are also, together with morado, the color of mulberries, and others of such sort, real jigsaw puzzles for historians, justifying the growth advantage in taking an holistic approach to research, networking with extended teams with different expertise. All the pieces described are for daily use, and this is just a summary up of what we have been listening. All the pieces described are for everyday use and do not reveal the ostentation that is commonly found in pictorial representation or in accounts of public ceremonies and festivities. This observation reveals the flexibility of this clothing, composed of layers to which a loose gown, girdles, and jewelry could always be added. The exception is perhaps the description of the gown in the document dated from the 26th August, in which the variety and above all the attention given to details lend a certain exceptionality to the documentation as a whole. These documents also attest to the fact that in the courtly environments of the 16th century, the courtiers had to master the art of tailoring so that communication could flow without misunderstanding from any of the characters involved in the process. The Infanta wardrobe also reveals a change in fashion, mixing both what we could call medieval garments and that had been used for long, and also the novelties coming from what was the rise of fashion in 16th century, coming from France and particularly Italy. And also, which is rather interesting when this presentation follows the one delivered by Joana, and also lots of garments that have an Arab origin, and that were part not only of the old wardrobe, but also of the tailor manuals that were published in the Iberian Peninsula throughout the 16th century. So this is, as I forgot to mention earlier, an ongoing project that has several layers of work and fosters a holistic approach to the understanding of fashion. And earlier I mentioned the embodied turn that has been discussed on the historical dressing studies. And I am most willing to discuss with you all the aspects that I focus here and others that I could not address because 15 minutes don't allow you to go much further. And I'm willing to answer any questions that you may have and to change knowledge the way you find suitable. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm sorry. I have a terrible allergy, and that didn't help throughout this presentation. Thank you so much.